Recently I did a video talking about how I was sad that the Vancouver SkyTrain Surrey extension was likely going to be delayed, and how the Ottawa O train was still derailing on a regular basis. I alluded to it in that video, but we've been to much worse places than this. In fact, there was a transit dark age, and I lived through it, so I can tell the tale. Now, this is a story about Canada, but at the end of the day, I think the same story applies to a lot of places around the world. Countries and even cities from different places globally that underinvested and didn't build transit and had a dark age, but then did a 180-degree turn and turned things around for the better and became a transit powerhouse. This video is all about telling you that if your country or city or province or state or any jurisdiction that you might be living in isn't making the transit investments that it should be, that doesn't mean it never will, and it doesn't mean that it can't. As I said, Canada went through a transit dark age, but now we're in a transit golden age. This is that story. So in order to make this video, I went back and looked at every major Canadian electric or rapid rail transit project that happened in the last 15 years. I looked at construction timelines and business cases and all kinds of documents, and I mapped things out, created some graphs, because who doesn't love graphs? So what was the transit dark age, and when did it happen, and why? So back when I was a youngin' in 2005, all the way up to like 2010, Canada had only 3 rail rapid transit projects underway. This is in a country that was growing massively. And that's not 3 new lines, that's 3 major projects. So I also counted extensions because it's a major project. Now, depending where you're from, 3 or 4 major projects might sound like a lot, but it really wasn't. Canada's biggest cities, Toronto and Montreal, basically weren't doing much in terms of new infrastructure. And most of the transit expansion we saw happening was smaller projects in Alberta and British Columbia, including the Canada Line, which is a project I love. Now, while the Canada Line and the Vancouver 2010 Olympics were great, this was a very sad and unexciting time because besides the Canada Line, there wasn't anything massively exciting happening in the entire country. I mean, extensions are great, but they're not the be-all end-all of a transit network, and new core capacity is really what gets people excited. That being said, there was the Laval extension happening in Montreal, which is quite the oddball when you think about it, because Montreal has really not built much new metro in the past several decades, and the Laval extension was only like 5.5 kilometers long with 3 stations, so a pretty small project, especially given how large Montreal is. Let's just say the Laval extension was not exactly a REM. As I said, Canada's population was booming at the time, the economy was doing pretty well, and yet very few projects were actually going on in the big cities to expand rail transit. And that's not even to mention the fact that we weren't building new rail transit systems in other cities. This was a weird time because existing systems were starting to get old and problems were cropping up left and right. You have to remember, the Vancouver SkyTrain opened in the mid-1980s and the Montreal Metro and Toronto Subway several decades before that, and they weren't seeing major expansion. There were tons of ideas in the transit community about projects we might build someday, but there was no sense that we would ever actually get there. New cities probably weren't getting electric rail transit systems, we probably weren't going to see massive new subway projects in Toronto and Montreal, and Vancouver was growing, but probably just because most of its construction was above ground. Now you might ask why any of this was happening, and I suppose one of the larger reasons was government policy. See, at the time when a new major transit project was going to be built, the way the funding worked was the city, the province, and the federal government in Canada, which is sort of our 3 levels of government, would come together to fund a project, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. The problem with this model is that it killed a ton of transit projects because cities simply couldn't come up with the billion or more dollars often required to build a new line or a major extension. What that led to was you saw a lot of lower cost systems built. You saw the Canada Line being built, though that was helped along by the fact that Olympics, so money was flowing. And then you saw light rail projects in Alberta being built because they were pretty inexpensive. Now, it's a bit of a weird thing because I talk a lot about how transit projects cost too much, and this policy of being really stingy with the money actually did result in a lot of pretty cost-effective transit projects, which we aren't seeing these days. At the same time, though, very little was actually being built. And honestly, I don't think this channel would have been all that interesting 15 years ago. albeit YouTube barely existed 15 years ago. Canada had only 5 urban rail systems at that time, they weren't growing that much, and the new stuff being built was just not that exciting. Not to mention the aging infrastructure, but Toronto was still using streetcars that were several decades old, and service was sort of lacking in a lot of places across the country. I mean, honestly, at that point, even I would have taken an Ottawa O train, and that's with hindsight, so it was a desperate time, and it was truly a dark age for transit. But then, everything changed. Around 2010, the Ontario government, and Ontario is Canada's largest province with a little less than half the population of the entire country residing here, decided to go transit rogue and basically said, okay, the federal government isn't really stepping up, we're going to step in and start funding large portions of transit projects ourselves. And the effects of that are still with us to this day. Ontario is still currently building more than half of Canada's rail rapid transit, and by 2012, it alone had 3 rail rapid transit projects under construction, and they were big ones. The Up Express, a new regional rail/airport express connector line that would kind of piggyback on major GO expansion work. The TYSSE, which would finally extend one of the main TTC subway lines, and not a small extension. This was over 7 kilometers, 6 stations, York University, a major destination, would be connected, and the subway would finally go outside of the city of Toronto. And then the Eglinton Crosstown, which is a 19-kilometer, 25-stop tram train hybrid thing. You know, at that point, we were incredibly excited to get anything, and the Eglinton Crosstown obviously is still going to have a ton of benefits, so it was an incredibly exciting time back in 2012. At the same time, LRT construction in Alberta was continuing apace, and Calgary opened its most recent extension. It's a little sad, but also it was a great extension, the West LRT, probably my favorite light rail line in the world because of how it's grade separated so heavily, and yet the design is so good, it's great. And the same year, Vancouver started construction on the Evergreen line, just about 2 years after the Canada line opened. Now, the Evergreen line was called the Evergreen line, but really it was just an extension. But oh my, the Evergreen line is still one of my favorite transit projects in the world because of the way it combines an incredible metro system, the SkyTrain, with nature in a way that no other system I've seen does. By the end of the year in 2012, the number of projects going on in the country had doubled to 6. Doesn't necessarily feel like a ton, but that means we were building at least one major rail transit project per city that had a rail transit system on average, and that was pretty good. 2015, though, was a weird time. The Albertan LRT projects were wrapped up and nothing was actually still being built. Though Calgary was talking about a Green Line BRT, we don't talk about that though. The Evergreen line was also almost complete, which meant that almost all of Canada's rapid transit was being built in just one province, Ontario, which was not a great look for kind of national transit construction and expansion. Of course, the transit construction was not just centralized in Toronto anymore. Waterloo Region and Ottawa had both started constructing systems. Of course, Canada also got a new federal government with Justin Trudeau at the helm, and things were about to change in a massive way, albeit in a few years. I guess this was also when I was inspired to move to Toronto to study computer science, because Toronto was building several subway projects while Vancouver was building one-ish. So it was sort of the natural place for me, a transit enthusiast at the time, to move. Come 2018, things still felt oddly uncomfortable. We'd had a new federal government for 3 years, and yet it didn't feel like an explosive growth in transit building had really happened. Now, the Evergreen line in Vancouver and the York subway extension in Toronto had both opened, and they were both awesome extensions. But they were both met with a little bit of consternation from the transit crowd, because now Vancouver had 0 rapid transit projects under construction, and Toronto only had the Eglinton Crosstown, which at that point was starting to feel a bit old. It had been under construction for more than half a decade at that point. It also felt really weird to only have one line under construction in the massive Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, given that it has like 6 to 7 million people in population and is sort of the economic hub of the country. On the other hand, things in Alberta were looking up. The Valley Line LRT in Edmonton just had started construction, but on the other hand, Calgary, Alberta's economic powerhouse, was not really building anything besides its MAX BRT, which is another BRT project in Calgary that we don't talk about. Towards the end of the year, things sort of took a turn for the dark though, because a conservative government was elected in Ontario, and a lot of people felt like the transit building spree that we had sort of been on in Canada was going to come crashing to an end. But then the big one came. The REM started construction in Montreal. And while the REM is a single project, the REM is 67 kilometers long, which means it's more than 3 times as long as the Canada Line or the Eglinton Crosstown, and it would be a full electric metro system, driverless too. At that point, it basically felt like Montreal was building its own version of the SkyTrain system in one go in a couple of years, which was incredible to see, and I think it sort of inspired new confidence that Canada could build transit. Given it had been over a decade since the Laval extension opened, I think that this sort of breathed new life into people's hearts, because we thought Quebec, of all places, was going to struggle to build rapid transit in the future, and yet Quebec was coming out with the most impressive rapid transit plan in the entire country, if not the entire continent. Just the next year, in 2019, Canada had 8 rapid transit projects underway. Ottawa committed to new major projects, including west, south, and east extensions of the O-Train network, before the first line even opened. Good move, Ottawa. The Finch LRT in Toronto also started construction, which surprised a lot of people in the transit space who sort of expected it to be nixed under the new Conservative government. I mean, the project is not that far from the Premier's own neighborhood. In a shocking turn of events, Doug Ford actually penned an op-ed where he said that he was wrong and that LRT was actually the answer to transit after all. Of course he didn't do that, but we kept the Finch LRT and it got under construction. In summer of the same year, the ION LRT finally opened in Waterloo. A new Canadian region had electric rapid rail transit, and the smallest region/city in North America to open such a system was now Waterloo. So I think that also inspired a lot of Canadian cities to say, wow, if Waterloo can build transit, we can probably do it too. Of course, Waterloo's investment paid off pretty quickly. Massive amounts of transit-oriented development have been spurred by the ION project, and it's already planned for a future extension. A few months after ION opened, the O-Train Confederation line opened in Ottawa, finally giving it electric rail rapid transit, and truly an impressive system when we checked it out back in 2019. That became the 7th rapid transit system in Canada, and I made a big video about how it was the 4th proper subway system that Canada got. Full grade separation, high frequencies, and the like. That was a big year for RM Transit as a channel, and we created tons of videos, we grew a ton, and we covered both the opening of ION and of the O-Train. And then there's today. There are currently 13 rapid transit projects going on across the country, and soon there will be 15. Double the number from just 2 years ago and 5 times the number from a decade ago. Justin Trudeau's federal government has gripped to power and been in power since 2015, and they have consistently funded transit projects that provinces and cities bring to them. Fortunately, also not following that 1/3 rule, which has been a game changer because it feels like basically any proper rail transit project that gets brought to the federal government gets approved for funding. And the federal government has also done a surprising amount on smaller stuff, funding station upgrades and transit hub upgrades and electric buses and the like, and BRT projects, which I'm not even talking about in this video. And different from the past, it's not just a few cities benefiting from the direction of the political winds. Every single major city in Canada is seeing rapid transit expansion. Vancouver is finally getting the Broadway subway. The Green Line has started pre-construction in Calgary. The Valley Line is going to go into pre-construction for its western segment in Edmonton, and the Metro Line extension there is under construction. In Toronto, early construction has started for 2 of the government's new subway extension projects. Next door in Mississauga and Brampton, a new, fairly long light rail line is deep into construction. And in Hamilton, their light rail project is set to start construction in the next year, adding yet another fairly long light rail line to another city in Ontario. I should say that the Conservative government in Ontario did cut back part of some of the light rail projects, and it pumped the brakes on the Hamilton project. But it also gave us 4 major subway projects in the city of Toronto, and has ended up funding the Hamilton LRT with the federal government's help anyways. With those subway projects in Toronto, not only does Toronto probably have the biggest true rapid transit expansion in North America, but with the REM and the Vancouver SkyTrain and Ottawa O-Train expansions going on, Canada isn't just building a ton of light rail like we were back in 2010. We're actually building a lot of subways and high-capacity rapid transit that's built for a future where way more people are actually using trains to get around. And so you can see that the transit dark ages were truly dark, but Canada is in a golden age now, and maybe not even a golden age, but a renaissance. The easy answer to why this has happened would be pro-transit political parties getting in power, but that doesn't seem exactly right. Truth be told, these days, both sides of the aisle are supportive of transit expansion, and in fact, the provinces with conservative governments, Ontario and Quebec, are the ones that are actually investing the most and expanding their transit the most. The culture of Canada has changed too. There are transit YouTubers abound, like myself. Young people aren't getting cars at the same rates as before, and way more people than ever before are living in transit-oriented developments near rapid transit. And not just in Vancouver anymore, but in Ottawa and Waterloo and Toronto. And transit-oriented development is huge now. It's become a critical piece of transit expansion plans in Montreal and Toronto. And that growing contingent of people that are living on transit, well, they are also voting for more transit and asking for more transit service, and we're seeing the fruits of that. So I think fundamentally the country has changed, and public transit has basically universal acceptance. It's no longer a question of should we build transit, like I often saw people arguing for in the past, but what transit should we build? And that's part of why my channel exists. I don't spend much time talking about cars on this channel because I take it as a given that transit expansion is what we need to do. The question is just how do we do it? Oh, and of course, I didn't even get to the projects that are coming in the next few years. The Surrey SkyTrain extension, new gondola transit projects in Edmonton and Vancouver, possibly entire new electric tram projects in Gatineau and Quebec City, planned extensions in literally every city that has an electric rail rapid transit system right now, Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Waterloo, Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal. It's incredible. Major streetcar expansions throughout Toronto's newly redeveloped waterfront, the Go RER program, which is probably by itself larger than all of the transit projects we had just a few years ago across the country, potentially new train service in other parts of the country, such as between Calgary's downtown airport and Banff, a second REM line in Montreal, new world-class intercity trains for VIA that are already arriving. I have a lot of fingers up. The VIA HFR project, which will create a dedicated passenger rail line between Toronto, Ottawa, Quebec City, and Montreal. As you can see, there was just a massive amount of transit being built in Canada. We did a 180, and it only took like 10 to 15 years, which feels like a long time, but in the world of transit, that's just like 2 subway lines. Canada went from building almost nothing to building more than most countries of its size in the entire world. When you do that, people get excited, and I got excited and started promoting transit not just here in Canada, but around the world. So when I see articles talking about how transit is doomed because of COVID or electric cars, I always just remind myself, transit is still the best way to get around a city, and it's only getting better in Canada, and not just in Canada. Look at Australia. Every major city, sorry Adelaide, is building a massive new rail project. Look at India. They built over 10 new metros in the past 10 years, and they're building more than 10 more. Look at the US, they're building fantastic systems in Seattle and Los Angeles and Denver, and yes, the US needs to do more, but it seems like they might be on the precipice of doing that. And look, Europe and Asia are doing the usual thing and building trains. Good on you. The world is reorienting itself towards transit, and I only think it gets better from here. Thanks for watching.